Salt Lake Tower, Diamond November 7807 tree at runway 34 are ready for departure, straight out departure.
Diamond November 7807 tree altimeter 29er. 9er 2 departing straight out approved. Cleared for takeoff runway tree 4R.
Cleared for takeoff runway tree 4 or Diamond 07 tree.
Salt Lake Tower, Delta 1 tree 6, 725 miles. West inbound ILS runway tree 4 approach.
I actually grew up a Christian, I would say nominal Christian, went to church every week, but never cracked open the Bible and really didn't know much about my faith. It was August 1977. I was teaching school. My husband was home during the day. 2 Mormon missionaries knocked on our door and he let them in. Not only did he let them in, he was kind of enamored with them.
The Church of Latter-day Saints.
We invited them back twice a week for about 10 weeks. The Mormon missionaries said they believed in the Bible, but the Book of Mormon was a companion book, and they kept giving us assignments to read from the Book of Mormon. And at the end of that 10 weeks, they, out of the Book of Mormon, gave us a challenge to go to our knees and pray about whether the Book of Mormon was true. We were expected to get a burning in the bosom that confirmed to us that Mormonism was true. My husband did have a spiritual experience, and then we both joined the church. Within 6 months of joining the Mormon Church, I stood in front of the congregation, bawling, and bore testimony that I knew, first of all, that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, that he had restored the Lord's only true church on the face of the earth. I knew that the Book of Mormon was true, that Joseph Smith had brought it to the earth, and that it was the most correct book on the face of the earth. I knew that the Mormon Church had a living prophet at the head, and that that prophet spoke for God. And I knew that Jesus Christ was my Savior, and that the Mormon Church was his church.
At the time that Joseph Smith was born in America, he was born in 1805 in Vermont. He was part of a whole group that were kind of into the mystic, into the supernatural, into the occult. And so when he and his family moved over into upstate New York a few years later, he and his family were basically swallowed up into the Second Great Awakening, which was a time of revival in the United States.
But during this same period, the Smiths were very much involved in magic, money taking, where they would use a magic stone or some sort of magic device like a divining rod to look for buried treasure.
For most of it, he used a seer stone, and he would put that into a hat, and he and his father and some others claimed that they could find buried treasure. And they charged a fair amount of money over the years.
There were a lot of rumors at the time that Captain Kidd or some pirate could have hid treasure in the area, so a lot of people were looking for these buried treasures.
Unfortunately, they never found any treasure, and in 1826, all of that caught up to them, and Joseph Smith was actually taken to court and was found guilty of something that was called glass looking. And glass looking refers to literally looking into a seer stone with the intent of finding buried treasure.
Many revivals were going through the whole New York, New England area.
It was a time of extreme religious excitement. People dancing, people throwing their hands up in the air, singing, chanting, seeing visions, snake charmers, the whole bit. And Smith's mother wholly bought into that. And she had it in her mind that at some future date, one of her sons would become a prophet. And so that's the environment that Joseph Smith grew up in.
claimed that in the spring of 1820, he went out into the woods nearby the home to pray, to ask God for direction what church to join. He claimed that God and Jesus appeared to him as two totally separate people with actual physical bodies, and that God told him not to join any church, that they were all an abomination in God's sight. All their creeds were an abomination, and that God had a work for Joseph Smith to do.
And so in the Sacred Grove experience that he had in 1820, the current prophets told us today that this is the foundation of our religion. If this is wrong, then our foundation is incorrect. Because without that, we have no authority coming from heaven to tell Joseph that all the man-made religions are incorrect.
Right around 1823, Joseph Smith was again praying in his room this time instead of out in the forest. And in response to his fervent prayer, an angel appeared in his room, and he told Joseph that his name was Moroni. He was sent by God to tell Joseph that God had a work for him to do, and that he was to go to a location to find a sacred book written on golden plates.
Moroni would have been the last person in the story of the Book of Mormon, the last man to engrave on the plates, that then hid the plates away in a stone box in a hill by Joseph Smith's house. So Moroni at this point is a deceased person that they claim had now become an angel that told him where the plates were buried.
And so within a couple of days of Moroni visiting him, he goes out into the forest, and sure enough, he finds this hillside now known as the Hill Cumorah. He goes into it and he discovers a stone box. He uses a lever to lift open the box, and inside is the book made out of golden plates. However, even though it's there, he cannot take it for another 4 years. And so every year at the autumnal equinox, he goes out, he checks in with the angel Moroni, and finally in 1827, 4 years later after the initial visit, the angel Moroni allows him to take the book, the Urim and Thummim, which were a special set of glasses that were called translators that Joseph Smith would use to translate these golden plates out of a language called Reformed Egyptian into English. And there was also a breastplate in there, and I believe a sword.
He describes them as being 6 by 6 by 8 rectangular plates of metal in a stack that were held together by 3 rings. So we're talking sheets of metal here that are stacked up.
And so Joseph takes all of these treasures back to his house, and he hides them. Actually, he hides them in a number of places. He moves them around because in his history, he claims that people are constantly trying to steal the plates from him.
Now, this record supposedly was written it says in the Book of Mormon, it was written in the language of our fathers, which would mean, we assume, the language of the Hebrews, but in Reformed Egyptian. And the reason for it being in Reformed Egyptian was supposedly that it took less space than writing it in Hebrew, which wouldn't really make sense because Hebrew would have been a better, shorter language than Egyptian to write something in. But that's the claim, and I think the reason Joseph decided to say it was written in Reformed Egyptian, that no one could read, to explain why he alone had the gift to translate it, and it wouldn't be taken to scholars to translate. It was a hidden, secret, changed language that only God could tell you how to translate it.
And so, starting in 1827, he starts translating the plates. Now this is interesting because instead of using the Urim and Thummim to do the translation, he actually uses the seer stone, once again, in the hat. And the other part of it that is so interesting is that the golden plates are nowhere in the room. They're not on the table, they're not in another portion of the room. In many times, they're not even in the house. So really, he's not translating them. It's as if the seer stone is feeding the text to Joseph in English that he then recites out loud for the different scribes to then write down as the Book of Mormon.
After Joseph Smith was finished with them, he gave them back to the angel Moroni, and the angel Moroni took them at that point.
When you look at the Book of Mormon, you will see that much of the Book of Mormon contains copied phrases out of the Bible. There's chapters out of Isaiah. There are a lot of stories in the Book of Mormon that would sound like Bible stories. There was a lot of speculation at the day that the American Indians were from the Lost Tribes of Israel. So I think Joseph Smith just collected bits and pieces from everywhere.
The Book of Mormon was written supposedly to show how God also had the American Indian in mind in terms of his long-range plans. And for this reason, we have the account of the Lost Tribes of Israel sailing across the Atlantic 600 BC or so, and they landed in the Americas and split into two groups, the goods and the bads, you might say.
The righteous people were the Nephites, and the unrighteous people were called the Lamanites.
And the Lamanites and the Nephites fought many different battles. Then they had peace for a while, and finally the Lamanites were cursed by God because they were evil.
So this is what it states in the Book of Mormon. It states this: "Wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome," this is the Lamanites, "that they may not be enticing unto the people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them." And so he separated the people. So the righteous people, the Nephites, were white, and the Lamanites, which were cursed, were the dark-skinned people.
Tragically, the Nephites were defeated by the Lamanites, and the result was the Lamanites being the only brand left when Columbus discovered America.
The people of the Lamanites became part of the darker-skinned races in America, the Indians, the people in South America and Central America.
One of the problems for the Book of Mormon is that all of the information about the society of the Book of Mormon peoples doesn't fit what we do know about the American Indian. And this is a problem for the Mormon Church. They don't have any artifacts, they don't have any maps, they don't have any sample of the writings that have come from a source other than Joseph Smith. So they're faced with this problem of not even knowing a location for the story. If you look in any Book of Mormon, there's no map in it. They can't agree whether it all happened up in the northeastern part of the United States, over all of North and South America, or just amongst the Mayan. And you will find Mormon scholars that argue for all different places for the story, which tells me there's no artifact, there's no sample of anything, or you would at least have a starting point.
If indeed these are lost tribes of Israel, well then there ought to be some DNA similarity between the Indian stock in the Americas and the Semitic stock. Very careful tests have been made, and the results absolutely no correlation whatever.
The Book of Mormon speaks of them having horses and elephants, and we know those weren't here until the Europeans came. The Book of Mormon speaks of them raising wheat. We know they didn't have wheat before the Europeans. The chariots and steel swords that they use in battle are totally foreign to the American Indian. There just was no such technology.
There are a lot of things that just violate the truth about what was existing here in the Americas at the time of the Book of Mormon peoples.
In the early stories of Mormonism, it's talked of the plates as being gold or golden. Joseph Smith referred to it both ways. I don't think Joseph had any idea how heavy gold would be. I have a model made up to the size he said, that it's made out of lead, which weighs less than gold, and that weighs 118 pounds. If his plates to the size and dimension he describes were made out of gold, they would have been over 200 pounds. This becomes a problem because, according to his story, he got the plates out of the hole, so you have this box of plates, that he picks up and runs 2 or 3 miles home through the woods with a couple of men chasing him. And there's just no way you could run that far carrying plates of gold.
When the Book of Mormon was finally completed, interestingly enough, Martin Harris, one of the founders of Mormonism along with Joseph Smith, the one indeed who had sold part of his farm in order to pay for the printing of the first edition of the Book of Mormon in 1830, he had asked Joseph Smith if he would be kind enough to jot down some of the characters in the golden plates that he was translating. And Joseph Smith was kind enough to do that. And then, without Smith's permission, he sent it to a professor at Columbia University in New York. And he was an Egyptologist. Now, this is before the translation of hieroglyphic because of the Rosetta Stone in 1837. That's going to come 8 years later. And the professor at Columbia University immediately looked at it and said, this is not Egyptian at all. This is someone's doodling. And at that point, of course, they never used that information in the future because it would discredit those characters in supposed Reformed Egyptian, a language that never existed.
Martin Harris was Joseph Smith's second scribe. He gave Joseph Smith a considerable sum of money, which angered his wife. And she kept pestering him for some kind of evidence about this book that Martin Harris was working on with Joseph Smith. Well, 116 pages come home with Harris. His wife looks at it, and according to the most widely publicized accounts, she throws it in the fireplace, burns it all up. In her mind, if this is truly from God, Joseph Smith will be able to retranslate and come up with the exact same material. Joseph Smith, always thinking, comes up with a revelation from God saying that because Martin Harris allowed his wife to burn the 116 pages in the fireplace, he was not going to retranslate that material, make it available for the world. Instead, he was going to translate a completely different section altogether.
So he prints the Book of Mormon first, and then a few months later starts his church. The Book of Mormon becomes the worm on the hook to get you to accept Mormonism. They say, well, if God spoke to people in the old world, surely he would have spoken to the new world. And that we have the record. And so they would give you a Book of Mormon and ask you to pray about it. When you read the Book of Mormon, you would see Bible language, these and nows, like the King James. It would have a lot of Bible verses and phrases. It would sound very similar. So this would give people the impression, wow, this really may be a Christian thing. But if you're going to accept the Book of Mormon, you have to accept Joseph Smith as a prophet. And once you accept him, then you're going to come into their church. The Mormon Church starts out in New York, and it included a lot of the Smith neighbors and associates in the area. But Joseph sent out missionaries, and some missionaries went to Ohio. In that process, they converted a Campbellite minister named Sidney Rigdon. And Rigdon was able to get a majority of his congregation to come into Mormonism. So at that point, Smith moves the whole church out to Kirtland, Ohio, and also a contingent to Independence, Missouri, where they're trying to set up Zion, the true community of God.
He's gaining converts left and right. They get to the point where they want to build a temple. They need to raise money because the temple is going to cost a lot of money. They form a bank.
But he can't get a charter for it. So when he publishes his money, Kirtland Safety Society banknotes, he has to go back and retype over the banknotes that it's an anti-banking establishment, because they don't have a charter.
For a guarantee on all of that money that they take in, Joseph Smith prints out $3 and $4 bills, and he issues them out as currency. Well, they weren't worth the paper that they were printed on.
Well, that works for a while until you have a run on the bank, and the word got around that the Mormons didn't have enough capital to really support the currency they were distributing.
And so that expression that you hear from time to time today, phony as a $3 bill, actually has its genesis in the Kirtland Society Bank. There was such a public outcry over the tremendous amount of money that was taken from the people of Kirtland that Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon actually were tarred and feathered, and then they fled to Missouri. Well, that was kind of like going from one pan into another.
People in the different communities didn't want them around. They were seen as a heresy group, a kind of a cult, and voted as a bloc. They weren't sure what their political leanings were. There were also charges of counterfeiting, of illegal transactions or misuse of funds. There were a lot of areas of concern.
And enough so that the people, the Gentiles as they were called, surrounding these different cities and counties got increasingly angered, and so there was violence back and forth. There was violence on both sides. Around that time, a group comes into being that are called the Danites, or Avenging Angels of Death. And they're a Mormon vigilante group that conducts violence on the people surrounding them. All of the violence on both sides was later called the Missouri Mormon War. And one final result of that was that the governor at that time issued something called an extermination order, which basically told the Mormons, get out of Missouri or face severe consequences. And so they did. And that caused them to move to Illinois, to a town that Joseph Smith would later call Nauvoo. Nauvoo was probably the biggest and best of the settlements.
When the Mormons moved to Nauvoo, Illinois, they basically took a swamp and built up a great city there. And they worked very hard, and it was a wonderful, beautiful city, and actually grew to be the largest city in Illinois at that point. It was even larger than Chicago.
Joseph Smith set himself up as the mayor of the town, and
he created his own military unit or paramilitary unit called the Nauvoo Legion.
However, they got about 2,800 men in their militia, so it's about a third the size of the United States Army at that point. This gave concern to the surrounding areas. People were worried. Here's this odd cult group led by this man that the community thought was kind of crazy that are raising this army, and they all vote as a bloc. So they could go to politicians and make deals on, I can deliver so many thousands of votes, what are you going to do for me? There were many things that gave people concern about the Mormons.
But behind the scenes, there was actually an evil thing going on that a lot of people didn't know about. Even the Mormons who lived them themselves, was the fact that Joseph Smith and the leaders, other leaders of the Mormon church at that point, were secretly practicing polygamy.
Now, he first started in polygamy in the 1830s, but it became an open practice in the 1840s at Nauvoo.
One of the problems with this is it had to be kept extremely secret because Illinois had a law in the books against bigamy. So they were worried about being arrested. So in order to keep it secret, Joseph Smith's looking for a way to bind men under a strong enough oath that they wouldn't be talking around about polygamy.
He also, at that time, openly embraced the Freemasonry. At the time that the Nauvoo Lodge was created, there were only 200 Masons in all of Illinois. In a matter of months, virtually every Mormon male in the Nauvoo area became a Mason.
This was a society that took secrecy and oaths very seriously. So I think he thought this might be an avenue for a way of keeping his own men faithful and keeping his secrets.
The way these people were elevated in Masonic rites was, it caused a lot of concern with the main lodge, because when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery became Masons, they became Masons one day, and then 24 hours later they became Grand Masons, 33rd degree Masons, which is unheard of. That takes years, decades to grow in Masonic lore and everything. When the Grand Lodge in Illinois heard about this, they threatened to shut down the lodge. In Masonic rites, you have various signs and tokens and handshakes. All or most of these were directly absorbed into the priesthood rituals, the endowment, all of the main rituals of Mormonism, almost without any modification whatsoever. When the Grand Lodge of Illinois discovered that, that was too much for them to bear. They considered Joseph Smith a loose cannon.
So Joseph Smith, when he was bringing up leadership, he would explain to them, again, this was not taught openly to the general Mormons, but that polygamy was an eternal principle and it needed to be practiced to progress onto godhood. And so as leaderships came up, they would introduce that practice to, and people would agree to it.
When Joseph Smith started practicing polygamy, he didn't just marry young single women, he also was marrying married women that had living husbands. As different ones of his male followers started putting the pieces together and realizing the extent that this was going to, they got considerably concerned that this was just looking like a free-for-all, not something that God would have ordained. Then he started approaching different men in his leadership for their wives. Some accepted this and let him have their wives as a pro-wife, but some rebelled. And one of the men that rebelled was a man named William Law. So he and several others rebelled against Joseph's ability to just pick and choose whatever woman he wanted, set up an opposition newspaper that they named the Nauvoo Expositor, exposing his polygamy, exposing his political aspirations, exposing his doctrine of plural gods. And they said in the issue that in coming issues, they were going to get more specific on all these areas. Well, this raised great concern to Joseph Smith. He was the mayor of Nauvoo, and Joseph Smith, as mayor, declared the press a public nuisance for printing slander.
He had his Nauvoo Legion or some other group come in and destroy the press.
They went out and just pulled the whole thing out in the street and broke it up, smashed it, so that they couldn't do another issue of their paper. They only got one issue out.
And so when that was destroyed, the governor of Illinois said, we cannot allow printing presses or freedom of the speech to be stopped. And this is how Joseph Smith got arrested and was put in the Carthage jail. Joseph's brother Hiram was also in there, and Mormons smuggled in various weapons to the two of them, including a revolver, clubs, knives. So when Joseph Smith was in the Carthage jail, he really didn't have any fear because he thought the Nauvoo Legion would come and rescue him, because the Mormons had the largest legion in Illinois at that point. And so it was just a matter of time before he would be rescued. But before the Legion got there, there was a mob that gathered outside of the jail. And so Joseph was basically going to shoot and fight his way out of the jail. And when the mob came up the stairs, Joseph Smith did open up the door and did shoot until his gun locked up. And I think he shot 3 people. 2 died immediately, and another one, I think, died later on.
He and his brother are trying to get out through a window, and at that point, Joseph Smith issues the Masonic cry for help. Is there no help for the widow's son? And he goes down in a hail of bullets, he and Hiram both.
But that whole concept of the gunfight going on in the Carthage jail was never ever taught to me as a Mormon, that Joseph Smith had a gun or anything, and was never taught to us as a Mormon why he was arrested and what happened with the Nauvoo expositor. That was all left out. It just states that he was arrested and put in jail. And, you know, the fact is that Joseph Smith just didn't stand there and be shot, but he was defending his life. And who came against him, we really don't know. Some people think it was actually Masons that dressed up, because Joseph Smith had actually taken their procedure from the Freemasons and incorporated it into the Mormon Temple Endowment. But we don't have any empirical evidence of that.
When Joseph Smith died, and his brother with him, it left the Mormon Church with a leadership vacuum.
The Mormons hold a conference because now their prophet is gone. They need a new prophet. Brigham Young comes forward, basically takes control of the conference, and assumes the role as prophet.
Brigham Young is my great-great-grandfather. My mother's maiden name was Young. And so Brigham Young stepped into the role of leader of the church, later proclaimed himself to be a prophet, and was the one that organized the Mormons to leave Illinois to start their trek west. They were looking at coming out to what we now would know as Utah, but they were looking at it because it was not part of the United States. At that point, it was a part of Mexico. And so when the Mormons headed west and came to Utah, they thought they were leaving the United States government. Right after they get here, you have the Spanish-American War, and the United States acquires that territory, and it becomes the territory of Utah, which put the Mormons back in the United States rule. As the Mormons grew in Utah, they sent more and more missionaries out around the world to make more Mormons, and eventually they started saying, you shouldn't come to Utah to gather to Utah, you should stay in your own communities. And so as they sent out missionaries, they started to grow Mormonism in other countries. And at this point, they have their Book of Mormon in, I think, 100 and some odd languages, and they're in more than 150 different countries around the world. So they're a growing presence, a growing missionary effort. Last year, I think they had about 80,000 young missionaries around the world.
It's really a rite of passage in Mormonism for young men to serve 2-year missions for the Mormon Church. It's kind of your growing up time into manhood. It's expected. If you can imagine this, it's customary in Utah territory for the postman to let the family know that the mission call is here.
And the phone rang, and I, jumped out of bed, ran to the phone, answered it, and it was the local post office, and they said, Elder Wilder, we've got a letter for you. And I was so excited. So my mom and I jumped in the car, and we went down to the local post office, picked it up, came home, and this is 6:30 in the morning, and we sat there at the couch, and I remember holding that letter in my hands and just feeling special.
The Mormon prophet supposedly prays to decide where your kids go on their missions. Micah was actually supposed to go to Mexico City. His lung collapsed in the missionary training center, and God sent him to the middle of evangelical Christian country, Florida.
We lived very dedicated lives as Mormon missionaries. We would get up at 6:30 in the morning, and we would do studies for about 3 hours, and then between 9 and 10 we'd go out, and for 11, 12 hours until 9 o'clock at night, we would proselytize and we would share the Mormon gospel, and we would knock on doors and we would ride bicycles and we would talk to people on the streets. And the reason why we did this, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, is because we truly believed that we had the message of the gospel, and that what we were bringing them was going to bring them, eternal life. And so I had that testimony in my heart, and I wanted other people to have what I believed that I had. Well, it was pretty difficult. I would say the majority of the time people didn't want to have anything to do with us. A lot of times the response was for people to tell us we were going to hell, or to slam the door in our faces, and a lot of these people were people that claimed to be Christians. And it was really difficult. It was very disheartening at first, but eventually we got used to it and did the best that we could. People would often ask us, well, are you guys Christians? And I was always very confused as to why they would ask us that, because in our mind, we were the only true Christians. We believed that we were the one and only true church on the face of the earth, and we would point right to our name tags that says the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we'd say, Jesus Christ is the center of the name of our church. We, of course, are Christians. We love Jesus. We believe that Jesus has saved us. We believe that we're saved by grace, and we baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And I would always wonder, why are people asking us if we're Christians when we are in fact the only true Christians who, live the way that the Bible tells us to live.
Mormons believe that they're Christian, but they are not Christian. Their theology is definitely not biblical, and their understanding of who God is not biblical.